You're listening to Natural Resources University. In this podcast network, our hosts are university researchers and extension specialists, opening your gateway to the science of natural resource management.
Pond University is your one-stop shop for all things pond management. It is hosted by Mitchell Ziske and Megan Gunn from Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Join us as we talk with biologists, managers, and pond owners about the topics and tools needed to manage your pond for good habitat and great fishing. So grab a notebook and a beverage and sit back and enjoy Pond University. G'day everyone, welcome back to Pond University. I'm one of your hosts, Mitch Ziske, and I'm joined by Megan Gunn. Hi Megan, how are you?
I'm good, Mitch. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. Excited. This is episode number 10 for Pond University, so a little bit of a milestone for us.
Nice.
With the podcast, and we've had some great responses and lots of downloads each episode, and I've been getting emails after every episode from people who have questions or suggest new topics. So that's great. I appreciate those, and keep them coming.
That's so exciting.
Yeah. I'm very. It's great to see that that there's been such a positive response. So whether you listen to it, by itself, or you listen to it as part of the Natural Resources University network, thanks for your support so far. And we're just hoping to grow and get bigger and better over the next 12 months. So. And we've got a great guest today to celebrate our 10th episode. We have Professor Joe Morris from Iowa State University who's coming to talk to us today. And his research and extension program focuses on aquaculture and pond management. And he's been doing this sort of stuff for a long time. And we're going to speak to him about lots of different things, but we're going to try and focus on aquatic vegetation and how to manage it and how to treat it, and some specific issues and problems that he's seen over the years with the work that he's done.
Perfect. I think this will tie really well into our Alga Bloom episode that is right before this one.
Yeah, that's right. And I'll say that, most of the questions I get from pond owners or lake associations is relating to vegetation, and typically, what do I have or how do I manage it or stuff like that. And so I think this is a timely episode coming into summer. I'm sure a lot of people have been dealing with vegetation already. And so we'll talk to Joe about some tips on managing some of the best steps to manage problem vegetation. We might talk to him a little bit about why vegetation is good if you want to grow fish, but also specific vegetation, some of the more problem vegetation species in the Midwest, and how you might treat those.
Yeah, I was just thinking about the good aspect of having vegetation, especially if you want to have fish surviving in your pond. They need some refuge. They need somewhere to go and hide. That's
right. Yep. So, yeah, looking forward to the episode, and looking forward to speaking to Joe. He has a lot of information. Essential Pond Terms, the segment where we hope to expand your vocabulary by defining important terms for pond management. One term that will come up a lot during this episode is siltation. Siltation is the accumulation of silt, soil, and clay particles in a pond. These particles will collect in rainwater as it washes over the land and will eventually be deposited in the pond. The amount of siltation in a pond depends on the size of the watershed and the type of land use practices on that watershed. A small watershed with lots of grass and woodlands will have much less siltation than a large watershed that experiences a lot of soil disturbance like tilling and construction. Siltation causes a number of issues in ponds, including excessive plant growth. Siltation will fill in a pond, decreasing its overall depth, as well as provide a soft substrate for plants to take root in. Siltation will also bring in excessive nutrients attached to the soil particles. Siltation is often difficult and expensive to treat, so the best management action is to prevent excessive siltation and runoff from entering the pond. Well, hi Joe, welcome to the podcast. It's great to have you on today. I know we've been looking forward to talking about some aquatic vegetation and a bunch of other things. So we're really looking forward to talk to you today. I know you've had a lot of experience in pond management and aquaculture. So I guess welcome to the podcast. And why don't you tell us a little bit about your role, current role at Iowa State?
Great. Thank you for the opportunity to visit with everyone on your podcast. My position, I'm currently the director of the North Central Regional Aquaculture Center. We cover 12 states, and it's a USDA funded program, and we fund both extension and research itself. And I've been the director here at Iowa State since 2012.
Okay.
Going on almost 10 years now.
Mm-hmm.
Time has passed fast.
Yeah.
And then I also deal with, like many of us have multiple appointments. I do research here at Iowa State, mostly on plankton dynamics and urban fisheries. I just finished up one of my last grad students on the urban fisheries project itself. I teach aquaculture. I've taught fish management here at Iowa State, and I also have a small extension appointment line. And then I got back into extension about 4 years ago.
Okay. That's great. Sounds like, yeah, I mean, like you said, we've all got multiple appointments and we're trying to keep multiple balls up in the air as we juggle. It sounds like you've done a lot of work in the pond and small lake and aquaculture settings, and you probably have a wealth of knowledge that you can share with us today about managing these small water bodies. So that the urban fishery stuff sounds really interesting.
Yes.
I mean, were you looking at sort of the viability and management of urban fisheries? Were you working more with anglers? Tell us a little bit about that.
Sure. My urban projects, I've had 4 or 5 projects funded with Iowa DNR over the years. And the last one was looking at the potential of using a yellow perch as a fishery, alternative fishery in urban ponds.
Okay.
In the state of Iowa, I think many other states, urban fisheries has become a much more prevalent and management scenario because the population base is urban. And even in Iowa, and I think Indiana, same way, even though the mindset of a lot of folks that were rural counties and that, but in reality is majority of the people in Iowa live in urban situations, municipalities. And how do you reach those individuals to think about the fishing opportunities and things like this? So a lot of the ponds that the state of Iowa has been dealing with and I'm sure Indiana's the same way, impoundment ponds. They were really meant to hold water coming off the watershed. But then the mindset is, I wonder why we can use those as fisheries itself. So with some modifications. And in fact, I'll talk about later, a lot of the issues we have, these impoundment ponds, a lot of it is, they were really never meant for fisheries to begin with, the shallow, rich nutrient systems. So along with that comes lots of vegetation and things like this. But yellow perch was the last one we looked at as an animal that stocked out adult, is a highly desirable stock fishery. Even in Iowa, most people think Iowa is mostly catfish, bullheads, and bass and bluegills, but yellow perch is listed as one of the alternative fishery in the state of Iowa. And so we found out they are able to survive in these small impoundments.
Interesting.
Okay. And then you're trying to reach a population base, not just urban or municipalities, but youth, and try to get those folks into fisheries itself. And a lot of the thing with urban ponds too is understanding the limits and the potential for these urban ponds, because they are located in highly modified watersheds, and that has its opportunities, also has its woes that goes with the urban situations.
I think that's really good advice for anybody who's trying to manage a small pond is understand the limitations to begin with and have a few clear achievable goals, and that'll help you a long way in your management.
my background, I grew up as a farm kid in Iowa itself, and I really did not have appreciation of how rich the nutrient base is of the Midwest and ponds until I was in the South for 10 years and came back. When I was in Texas for 6 years and Mississippi for 4 years. You know, a lot of my education, my graduate programs down there is we are taught how to fertilize ponds, how to make them green, how to get what I call plankton bloom. And it's twofold, helps to submerge some of the plants growing from the bottom, but also for increased fertility of the pond itself. However, but when I came back to the Midwest, not only did I find nutrient base tenfold higher in the Midwest than everything I saw in Texas and Mississippi, even after bi-weekly fertilization of high phosphorus and high nitrogen, is that we have a high nutrient base. And a lot of the things, but on the other hand, we have 2 to 3 times the amount of biomass that's in a fish that's in that pond, and you see in Texas and Mississippi, Alabama. So it's kind of like it's a benefit of high nutrients. It's also a con because we have high nutrients that go into the pond, and that's where we get the vegetation, the nutrients, and the algae, and why the ponds are not blue. Most Midwestern ponds are brown, green. I've seen red, I've seen them white, everything but blue.
Yeah. No, that's right. I think, it's great for people who want to grow fish and have a productive pond and can understand some of those dynamics with those nutrients there, but, for those that want a clear pond or those that want a nice swimming pool pond, then it can definitely get challenging.
And a lot of people, but a blue water tells you it's in fertile water. And so you may not have the fish production in those ponds. So you just got to figure out how to mold that pond to give the goals that you want out of that system itself.
And so going back, I guess, to yellow perch, I know some people reach out to me occasionally about interest in putting yellow perch in their ponds, and so in this project in the urban setting, were you stocking out fingerlings? Were you stocking adults that were like a put and catch sort of fishery?
We have to stock out adults for them to get the reproduction. You stock out as fingerlings. Some of these ponds already had bass populations in there. But even that said, you really need to give them the opportunity to spawn at least once, twice before the fisheries take place. And adults, and then put in what we found, you had to put in some spawning habitat, Christmas trees, things like that, and shells of the pond. And we've got several papers coming out on that, how to locate that habitat for the fish itself. But you really need adult yellow perch to go in for what I call a sustainable population. Because what happens with yellow perch, I don't know what you've experienced been in Indiana, when the fishers find out there's yellow perch in the pond, they can easily get depleted of the stocks, and so you don't get any reproduction. So what you really need to start with the adults yellow perch, and we've got stocking rates and all that. We can provide anyone who would like to see those type of thing. But it's an alternative. Fisheries base that's in this, because the thing is, what I found, when you think about the Midwest, most what people think of largemouth bass, bluegills, and channel catfish. That's the mindset. That's a mantra that goes throughout the Midwest. It all go back to Auburn University. I mean, you think about that scenario, all that pond management really goes back in the Southeast. You go up to, in the Midwest, you go up to Minnesota, Wisconsin, and some more northern states, you're talking about smallmouth bass, you're talking about golden chinas, you're not talking bluegills, things like this. So even in Iowa, not everyone wants largemouth bass, bluegills, and catfish. They look at alternative species. So what are those alternatives? Could be yellow perch. Some people put in hybrid sunfish. My problem with hybrid sunfish that they do reproduce. You bring in green sunfish genetics into the pond. I'd rather not do that. I spent 20 years working on hybrid sunfish as an aquaculture species, but I'd be cautious about that.
Hmm.
And that's where the yellow perch comes in. You can't really put smallies in these small ponds. They're
Yeah.
not going to be able to compete against largemouth bass,
Mm-hmm.
things like this. So it's just an alternative species, especially in a unique scenario for urban fisheries itself.
Yep. No, I think you were right in that. I think in a lot of places throughout the country, urban fisheries is really exploding. The populations are moving more urban. I've just been working with the Columbia Park Zoo here in Lafayette. They just renovated their pond. I think it
It's
was
really
like
nice.
50 years old. They removed like 4 feet of silt from the pond,
Yeah.
and that's driven by, well, they want to have a nice pond, for people to hang out around, but they really want to facilitate urban fishing. Pond Species Profile, the segment where we will showcase the biology and ecology of popular and not so popular pond species. In this episode, we will profile 2 pond species. You've just heard how yellow perch can be stocked in ponds as an alternative fish species. Yellow perch are a cool water fish found throughout cooler parts of North America. They are commonly found in natural lakes, including the Great Lakes. They grow to a couple of pounds and are a popular sports fish and an excellent eating fish. They are also important prey for large fish like walleye and smallmouth bass. Care needs to be taken when stocking yellow perch into a pond because they have high rates of reproduction and can overcrowd a pond easily. On the flip side, if the pond water temperature gets too high or there is too much predation by bass, yellow perch populations may struggle to survive. If you are interested in stocking yellow perch in your pond, we recommend reaching out to a pond consultant and working with them to achieve the best results. Later in the episode, we will discuss using grass carp as a biological control for aquatic vegetation. Grass carp are originally from Asia and were introduced into the United States for aquaculture. Sterile forms of grass carp have been developed so that there is less risk of them reproducing if they escape into natural waterways. If you plan to stock grass carp in your pond, you must use a licensed fish hatchery to ensure that fish are sterile. Grass carp prefer to eat submergent vegetation like pondweeds and coontail. They are less effective in controlling algae, duckweed, or emergent vegetation. Grass carp will consume the most vegetation in the first 5 to 7 years of their life, slowing down as they get older. As such, you may need to replace the fish in your pond periodically to maintain their effectiveness. I'm sure we could talk about fish and urban fisheries for a long time, and we might have to get you back to talk about that. There's definitely a lot of
Oh, no
interest
problem.
around here, but given that where things are warming up here in the Midwest, they've been warm for a little while now. I imagine a lot of people are seeing a lot of vegetation growth in their ponds, and you mentioned the ponds in the Midwest are nutrient rich, and that's great for growing fish, but it's also great for growing vegetation and growing algae, and which fish need, but sometimes we get too much of that. So I thought we could talk a little bit about vegetation. Some ways to manage it. What are some of the things you should be thinking about when you maybe you first got a pond, or you've bought a property with a pond and you've got these vegetation issues, and then maybe we can get into some specific details about some species that are more problematic than others, and maybe some ways to manage them, and anything that you've found through your years of research that might be interesting or relevant to some of these pond owners.
Well, I'm sure, I don't know how Indiana's been. Iowa's been really dry this spring until recently. We started getting rain. So I'm getting maybe 6 or 7 calls a day on algae. Some people call it water moss, but it's algae itself. Remember, so as the ponds dry up, the nutrients get even richer because the nutrients get more concentrated. And a lot of these ponds too, in my mind, when you have a pond, the biggest culprit for ponds in the Midwest is siltation in off the watershed. And you want the watershed for the water going into that system, but also goes with siltation. And so a lot of folks, when I deal with people, one of the questions I ask, how old is that pond? And I've seen ponds 5 years old have silted in 50% since it was built. Some ponds list for 30 years. So you ask yourself why. So a lot of it is prevention. Think about the pond, think about the watersheds around the pond. A lot of folks never thought about putting a buffer strip around the perimeter
Mm-hmm.
of the pond itself, 10, 20 feet deep, wide. It doesn't mean you got to be waist high. You could be 12 inches tall. You're trying to intercept that silt coming off
Yeah.
the watershed. And there's some misunderstanding. A lot of folks look at agriculture as a culprit for that. They have its role, but also urban situations. I've had projects in the past that look at siltation events off of grass waterways. And you'd be
Mm-hmm.
shocked the silt that comes in. Along with the silt that comes in, lots of phosphorus that comes into the system itself. So you got those type of things. The calls I've been coming in, also one thing I try to go with folks, one thing is, first thing I ask is how deep is the pond? And they really question what it is. Do a simple thing, get an idea what the depth is like. I was dealing with a church pond 2 weeks ago outside of Ames. I said, take a simple weight canoe and go across the middle of it and see how
Mm-hmm.
deep that thing is. And you can actually look at these ponds. You've been around ponds quite a bit, and you can tell where the silt is. You can look at the perimeter like a bathtub ring with the algae itself.
Mhm.
I think you have appreciation of how much silt has come in compared to original drawings when that pond was built.
Yeah.
And that silt gives you interest in the form of nutrients, and those nutrients are here to stay. So those type of things, think about. You deal with issues, what type of vegetation we have. Is it algae? Not everything's algae. There are some vascular plants that looks like algae. And you can put all the herbicides you want and find out it doesn't do a darn thing for some of those plants itself. So the thing is, you really need to get a handle on what you're dealing with and how much it is on that.
Mhm.
Mm-hmm.
And before you can think about the strategy itself. But a lot of it is prevention. If you have highly erodible soil, a lot of Iowa is that way, Western Iowa, and I'm sure Indiana the same way. Think about prevention could be as simple as putting a siltation ponds in the upper waterways of the pond itself. Intercept that silt going in. I mean, if you have a small little 10th acre holding area for the silt, all you have to do is bring a backhoe in every 5 to 7 years and pull it out, move it out somewhere else. What you don't want to have to do is go through and try to get a backhoe and try to pull that silt around the edge of the pond. I've seen ponds, I imagine you have too. I've seen ponds that look like a donut, but the hole is the only place that has clear water. Everything else has algae weeds in it, things like this. So a lot of it's the prevention. Think about the watershed. Think about the connection to the watershed. This is something that we in fisheries have finally realized. When I went through my fisheries program, I recall seeing a great connection between watershed and water quality. As again, we're focusing on fish population, bass, bluegills, all those type of things. My major professor at Texas A&M was one of the renowned experts on largemouth bass in the southeastern United States. But we really never talked about nutrients much. But I think you really need to have that appreciation. The biggest thing, one thing you have to think about nutrients when it comes to the Midwestern ponds. A lot of folks, when they went through school, I have heard phosphorus is always the limiting factor in some of these ponds. Nitrogen is. This is where you start getting your cyanobacteria coming in later on the year. So it's not phosphorus, it's nitrogen. As soon as it starts raining, here comes phosphorus into the system itself. But that's the biggest thing about prevention. There's also things on maintaining depths of the pond itself. Always remember vegetation needs nutrients, sunlight, and light penetration. Nutrient that. And it's a perfect recipe. If you have a pond that's 4 feet deep, high nutrients, you're going to have vegetation. You just figure out how you're going to shape it, things like this. But let me phrase about vegetation. Vegetation itself is not necessarily bad. Pond, it doesn't, for a good fisheries, you need to have a component of a fish. You need fish, need water, but you also have vegetation. Vegetation itself is not bad. So you don't want a pond devoid completely of all vegetation because you're not going to have a good fishery. So you have to find that combination for you.
So, I think you raised some great points about prevention. A lot of people, whether it's a new pond or whether it's one they've had in the family for a long time, they see some vegetation, some algal problems, and their first reaction is to grab the chemicals and see what they can do with that. And the problem with that is, chemicals are great and they have their purpose, but if you're looking for a long-term solution, that you might just end up spending a lot of money and chasing your tail there. Whereas with some of these prevention mechanisms, you can really sort of limit the problem you're going to have in the first place. And
So I always tell folks to think about year in, year out. If you have vegetation and you have maybe 10 or 20%, and I'm not one for percentages because every pond's a little bit different. There's some papers out there that says it's supposed to be 20%. That's ideal world. Nature does not like being shaped by man of how we want to be. But thing is, if you have a pond that's 20, 25% year in, year out, fish population's good shape, you haven't had fish kill, and it has not changed drastically among the years, don't worry about vegetation. It has done whatever it has. Nature, that pond has settled into the situation is more, I've been in the ponds way too much, as my wife has told me. Not everyone finds ponds as exciting as you do, but ponds have a situation. There are ponds that can do quite well with some vegetation year in, year out. Why worry about it? Don't chase the chemical or the biological alternatives. If it's doing well, leave it as it is.
Yes. So what window does it look like? Should they wait a year or 2 or 3 to see how balanced
I would say wait 2 to 3 years. Also, a lot of new ponds. Some of the urban ponds, go back by urban ponds, but I had some ponds down in Des Moines who had a lot of water, Portobellitan, which is a type of pondweed. First year, a lot of times you'll have a pond and have a lot of vegetation year one.
Mm-hmm.
And I had there was by a church down there, and the pastor who was really interested in the pond, he wanted to control it right away. He said, no, hold on, just take a chill. And then in the following 2 years ago, this year has cleared up. So a lot of it is new ponds. So some ponds we get the vegetation up front, but just take a chill. Take 2-3 years, see if this is going to be a problem now.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that's there's a lot that you can achieve with pond, whether it's a vegetation or whether it's fish. Sometimes just waiting is a good thing to do. Because it takes a little while for things to get in balance. The vegetation in a pond goes through succession just like it does on land, and the plants will compete with each other. And so with a new pond, you might need a couple of species in there to start competing, and then they find their balance. I think that's a great advice. You can always wait and see what happens, and then but if you go in and start meddling, you can make things worse, and it can just end up being really expensive.
Yeah, because there's a mindset, when you look at some of the other type of prevention, there are other ways you can use aqua shade. That's a blue dye that goes in there. And that's food grade dye. There's no limits on that. You can do that. You can shade out things. But like I say, you have to look at a pond and the fisheries as a maintenance issue, just like your yard. Hopefully you take better care of that pond than I take care of my yard. That's another story in itself. But you have to, it's a maintenance issue. You just don't deal with the pond and walk away and expect to be blue water and expect to have large bass coming out. It just doesn't happen that way.
Yeah.
Things like this. And mindset, so a lot of mindset in Iowa, and I think I used to work for the Indiana DNR one summer.
Really?
Yeah, up in Michigan City. I spent some work on St. Joe River out there. I digress. But I remember at the time in Indiana, I don't know things like grass carp. Can you use grass carp in the state?
You can, yes. You can use grass carp. You've got the
triploid
license. The triploids, yep.
Yep. In Iowa, you still use diploid itself. But here's the case where I have people have new ponds, they start grass carp automatically. No. Don't be stocking those things automatic. A grass carp is just a tool, part of your tool chest, just like as prevention, other thing else. And don't automatically stock those into the pond as a matter of course till you know for sure what you're going to have, what issues you're going to
The
have.
problems are going to be, yeah.
Because they could be overused, just like you overuse chemicals.
Mm-hmm.
And that, so I'd wait 3 to 4 years, see if you got a problem, and then be cautious when you use them, when you do those. And I would not go in. I'm speaking to someone who my master's was on grass carp in Texas, and so think about going back to what Mitch was talking about. We took a 26,000 acre reservoir outside of Houston, Texas. We had hydrilla. Don't know if you ever seen hydrilla or not in Indiana. Usually more southern states.
We've
Exotic
had,
plant.
I think some lakes here have had some hydrilla come in.
It's some really nasty stuff. We had this lake was 48% covered with hydrilla.
Wow.
They stocked out 250,000 grass carp in the pond. She took a weedy but clear water state to a pea soup. So I'm a firm believer in the nutrients. The shape of vegetation, all you're doing is changing the shape of the vegetation, be it pea soup, plankton, or is it vascular plants?
Yeah.
And they completely control hydro within, I want to say 18 months.
Wow.
And because they found that the bass are not growing well because there's so much habitat for the prey base, things like this. So I'm getting at is you don't miraculously stock a bunch of grass carp in and change everything you want, because it's not that simple. Put it this way.
Yeah, and we've done some stuff on this podcast before where we've tried to sort of talk a little bit about the different components of the pond ecosystem, and it's particularly with smaller ponds, it's easy to think of them just a little bit like a puddle in the ground. But even a small pond is quite complex. There's lots of interactions between nutrients, temperature, the invertebrates, plants, fish. So there's lots of things going on. And if you think, you're going to go in and use one of your tools on one of the attributes of that ecosystem, sometimes it can be hard to predict what's going to happen out the other end.
Because vegetation it serves as a substrate for a lot of invertebrates. Everything from chironomids to other insects itself, which is prey base for a lot of the larval fish. Be it bass and bluegills, things like that. So it's all what you're getting down was it's all a major part of the component of the whole system itself. And that's why I was getting at. Don't automatically assume you're gonna have a vegetation issue until you actually know that you have it and what type do you have.
And getting professionals to come and assess that is probably key too, and not just going and doing it on your own if you're not an expert yourself.
And what has happened as the years have gone by, the biggest deal when you deal with aquatic vegetation, I would argue the majority of the battle is what do you have? How do you identify it? And in the state of Iowa, a lot of what has happened as the years have gone by, I've been in Iowa State for 33 years this week, by the way. And so now things have, sometimes technology is good. I actually have people send me pictures, the cell phone, of the vegetation, and that's half the battle. What are you dealing with? What type of vegetation you're dealing with, and how bad that vegetation can and could be, and if you want to control things like this. So I get I used to get samples in the mail all the time, and then I tell you one thing: you don't want to have vegetation samples sent to you mid-July, Midwest, because it's kind of unpleasant experience when you open up the container in the mailroom, things like this. Now, so people send me pictures. We can actually go in and see what we have. Most of the time, you can identify about 80% of the species you have. Every once in a while, I have a species sent to me. But that's half the battle, what you're dealing with. And it goes back to what you're talking about, algae. There's a mess. There's sometimes people think it's moss or algae. Sometimes folks think it's moss, algae, filamentous algae. When in reality, it's probably might be sago pondweed or some other vascular plant. You really have to figure out what you have, try to deal with.
Yeah, there's definitely a few plants that can look like algae, and there's definitely some algae that looks like plants, right?
Oh yeah. Yes.
And so that's actually a great, I'll take this opportunity to put in a plug for our extension program here. We're actually working on a revised aquatic vegetation management publication, and as part of that, we're going to have some waterproof little cards that'll help landowners with their plant ID. So we put out a fish ID one a couple of years ago, and this is something you can throw in your truck or throw in your tackle box, and if you're walking around your pond, you might be able to get close with that ID, and that can help you choose how to manage it.
Sure.
And I think, we've mentioned this before with regards to fish populations in ponds, but this goes back to what we were talking about earlier on, is that the more you can understand your pond and the more you can learn about your pond from the get-go, the better off you're going to be. If you can keep an eye on things, get an understanding of the depth, like you said, Joe, or maybe have a look to see where that sediment's coming in from and what you might be able to do to prevent that. If you can take a look and keep an eye on things year to year, and like you said, someone might come into a pond and think, wow, that's quite a bit of vegetation, but if that's something that's been going on year and a year and it doesn't impact your use of the pond, doesn't impact the fish, then just leave it alone and rather than trying to take that out of balance. So I'm a big advocate of these people getting out and looking at their pond, keeping some records, looking at the depth, it might be that you've got some siltation that's causing you a problem, and if you can deal with that, then you won't, your pond may clean up really well. So
it's been my experience, by the time a lot of times when they do an idea of how deep the pond is, I think they finally come to realization of how bad the siltation has been over the years. I think when you first look at a pond, you don't really realize it unless you deal with ponds quite a bit, how bad that can be. And I would argue, I think I've said this once before, is that siltation the number one culprit in small ponds in the Midwest.
Yeah.
And once you lose that depth, then you have more vegetation, you have more chance of winter kill on a year, shallow depths, things like this.
Yeah. And I think that, if you're looking to build a new pond, if you can try and add some decent depth to that to begin with, to allow for some siltation over time. And then I guess, if people do have very heavily silted ponds, are there other alternatives, or is it really just, trying to get a backhoe in there and cleaning some of that silt out?
In typical size pond, that's about the only alternative you have is very large backhoe, or sometimes I've seen some ponds, I advise breach the dam. That's the most drastic option, because you got to start over. But you got to realize that you can take 2 feet of muck and it'll dry up to about 6 inches. There are some in small ponds. There are some products out there that or bacteria are supposedly consuming some of the silt and things like this. I don't know. I'm not convinced. I think in small impoundments, when you have lots of aeration, perhaps, but I wouldn't count on it. It's you'd have to put a whole lot in there, and because silt is silt, and you really need to get that out of there as much as possible. Another thing on prevention, when I'm thinking of it, is some folks think about aeration, and again, that's another part of the toolbox, not a solution to everyone's issues.
Okay, so we have some tools now for people to think about, and they whether depending on what stage of pond ownership they're in, whether it's new, whether they've had it for 50 years or whatever, they can make sure they get a good idea of the depth and where the runoff is coming in from the watershed. Maybe they can do some prevention with a buffer strip or other things like that. Maybe put an aerator in. Try and use this sort of holistic approach to build a few things in, a few insurance items to really help their pond be healthy. But unfortunately, at some point, many people or many of us are going to have problems with algae or plants, and so I just thought, are there any species or any types of vegetation that you see cause more problems than others, and of those, what are some ways that we can treat for those if you get them?
Well, one of the biggest culprit I see, maybe you see it, is algae, filamentous algae. So a lot of people need to understand there's thousands of species of filamentous algae, but just algae, a lot of people. And so that has been, it seems to always exist, filamentous algae, things like this. There's several types of algae that they're not all the same though. Early in the spring, you have algae that's really bright green. Those are usually doesn't last long. It's really almost neon green colors. It treads. It's really cool. Well, water algae, you don't see that much. I take it in your hand. It's usually bright green, almost lime green. And, it's a moment in time. Not to worry about that. The biggest issues are some of the green algae, Cladophora, Pathophora is a type of genus out there. You take up in your hand almost like a cotton ball. You pick it up in your hand, things like this.
Okay.
If you think you're sure it's algae, a lot of folks will use some of the copper compounds. One of the go-to ones a lot of people use because it's cheap, relatively available, is copper sulfate. Thing to keep in mind, you have all chemicals for aquatic use has to have category 5 aquatic label. So before I go into great detail, users really need to read the label instructions on the limitations. What are the restrictions? Can animals drink out of the water? What are the issues? Copper sulfate is relatively cheap, about 25% copper. It does pretty good job, but settles out really fast. Water that has high alkalinity. And I'm sure Indiana, the same thing, Iowa, that. And so you may only be in solution for 10 days and it will settle out. So the thing about copper, there's no free lunch out there. Copper is a metal that does not break down. So you could see copper resistant algae as a result of 5 to 6 years. As you may find yourself, if you're using copper sulfate, you may find yourself after 5 to 6 years, all of a sudden that algae is being resistant. So not only that, but you also affects the invertebrate populations in the ponds itself. All of a sudden you don't see insects. You see oligochaetes. So some of the limited usability as a food resource. So be careful. I would argue be careful with too much of that copper sulfate stuff because it can be toxic if you use too much of it, really based on alkalinity of the pond itself, the carbonates in the water. Also, something that I never realized it until after I got into vegetation management. Copper is very dangerous to sheep drinking out of the pond itself. And also dangerous to trout, some of the koi, things like this. So you gotta be careful with this. So as years have gone by, I've gone to Q-Treen Plus, which is a chelated copper, less copper by 8% versus 25, because copper never breaks down. It stays in solution longer. It's more expensive, but it's better. I like the fact that it's less copper, things like this, and it doesn't. And I really caution about putting too much copper in that because one of my past projects I had grad student look at the effect of copper on invertebrates, and at 25% of the copper application, copper sulfate, you'll kill your invertebrate populations.
Wow.
So you're doing that at the same time you're trying to get bass and bluegills to survive. Fry, figuring they may be a problem. So that's one thing, filaments of algae.
I guess one thing I just wanted to ask you about copper, and you might know this. I'll get questions from people. They're concerned about too much copper in their pond. Do you know if copper is something that bioaccumulates in fish?
Does it bioaccumulate?
Okay.
That I know of, because I had another grad student work on that. But it does bioaccumulate, but it accumulates as a total mass.
Yeah.
I've actually pulled samples out of pond sediments, and I was shocked at the amount of copper that's in the system itself. But it's relatively cheap. It's the same thing. People looking for a fairly easy way to do it. And copper sulfate is one of those things is, again, you need to have aquatic label. There's different types of copper sulfate out there, but it needs to have aquatic label that goes with it. Things like that. It's also very corrosive, by the way. Copper sulfate is very corrosive to anything that's steel. So if you put it out there, you better make darn sure you don't use a stainless steel sprayer because you won't have much when you get done. So, and then you have also with copper sulfate or the bluestone is done, or blue vitriol is what they often call blue. You have to dissolve it. You just can't cast 10 pounds of copper sulfate in the body of water because it settles in the sediments. You have to dissolve the sediment. That's why Q-Treen Plus, it's a liquid, it's a little bit easier to deal with, and it goes in solution better itself.
Yeah.
So
We tend to use the chelated copper mostly for our ponds here, and just because we've got hard water, but
yeah,
also because it's easier to apply, less copper going in, and it still does a great job. It's more expensive, but you sort of get what you pay for.
yeah, it's and I like the fact that it's less copper. Is what the issue is. Things
Yeah.
like this. Other issues I've seen over the years past is duckweed,
Yeah. Okay.
watermill.
Mm-hmm.
And the biggest problem I have a lot of times is what's the difference, with watermill is I always tell people, well, you can tell watermill when you take it in your hand, it feels like bits of sand.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That's watermill. And I would argue, in my years I've dealt with aquatic vegetation, watermill is one of the most difficult plant to control.
Okay.
I mean,
Interesting.
I don't know how to. I mean, and you're really limited on chemical control, things like sonar, Floridon, which is about $500 a quart.
Yeah.
Wow.
And it's the whole pond treatment, and I don't know if sonar is approved in Indiana. I think it is.
It is. Yep.
And you have to do a whole pond treatment, so it's a long-term chemical control. But you're killing everything.
Mm-hmm.
You just don't hit that.
Mm-hmm.
There's also something called clipper. Don't know if you heard of that or not.
I have.
There's
Yep.
a clipper out there, but it's limited by high pH.
Okay.
So you got to be careful. Anything more than 8.5. So here's something else you really have to think about in the Midwest, because the fertility is so blasted high. Yeah, even though we have high alkalinity, I've seen pHs in bodies of water 10.5,
Wow.
10.5 in the afternoon.
Yeah.
And we all in all limnology, things should be not going more than 9.
Uh-huh.
I've seen 10.5 at 2 o'clock in the afternoon.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
So you imagine what clip would do with clip things like this.
Mm-hmm.
There's also chemicals like diquat or
Mm-hmm.
reward. That's another one you have to be worried about when you put out. You don't want to stir up a lot of clay particles because you can deactivate it at the same time. But again, read the label instruction. Be sure you understand what are the limitations. You don't want to be putting a chemical into a body of water, find out you cannot irrigate a golf course with it,
Mm-hmm.
or or cattle drinking out of it, things like this.
Yeah.
But duckweed's problem, I would argue watermill is the worst I've had to deal with in years past. A lot of time we have also things like coontail.
Mm-hmm.
Coontail is a submergent vegetation. Looks like one of those few plants that are easy to tell. And you pull it up, looks like a coontail. It's something like that. And those are grass carp. We do pretty well. Grass carp has a preference, submergent vegetation. They don't do. I don't think they do that well for filamentous algae. They like submergent vegetation, things like this. You see a lot of pondweed. We have American pondweed here, Illinois pondweed, Potamogeton is the genus, quite a few out there. And easiest way for a lot of people to understand what idea is they usually have a spike head on top of the water. And this time of the year, you see this little spike head on things like this.
Mm-hmm.
Those can be controlled by the chemical itself. Things that another plant that I've seen that's difficult to control is cattails.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Extremely difficult, very aggressive plant.
Mm-hmm.
You have 2 cattails one year and you have 20 cattails the next year.
Yeah.
And they usually indicate that, especially if ponds are shallow or low, and because they just open and they just really aggressive comes to what I call moist soils, things like this. So cattails you can use. You use some of the liquid based glyphosate that goes in it, Roundup. You cannot use Roundup because Roundup, here's a classic example. Roundup, one, it's illegal to use aquatic use. 2, secondly, the surfactant in Roundup is deadly to fish.
Mm-hmm.
So you have to use another one that's, I think Rodeo is the name. But anyway, it's got aquatic label. You have to put another surfactant on it, but it's not one treatment only. You need to treat cattails right at fruiting stage.
Mm-hmm.
And you're probably going to have to hit it again that fall, right before the first hard freeze. Because you got those turions, root structures. You really need to get that chemical down into control. But I would argue, and I was dealing with another pond one Saturday, and I said, well, that cattails tell me you have siltation coming in that pond itself. And that's what usually the pond would tell you what's going on. Things like that. And cattails one of those issues. But there are other plants are not necessarily all that bad. Arrowhead is I call it very docile. It's there. I like it. It's on the shoreline. So why control it if it's not that aggressive a plant itself?
That's a good
And
point.
then you also have things like, I'm sure you have some exotic plants in there. You have curly leaf pondweed. Have you seen that curly leaf?
Yeah, we've
usually
seen that.
Early in the spring and dies off as soon as it gets warm.
Yep.
And you start having a biomass. You have some things that. But when you deal with chemicals, I always warn folks, if you deal with chemical control, summertime, we always remember warmer the water, less oxygen's in the water. And if you do chemical control, like you have a high filamentous, you got a candle burning on both ends. If you don't do something, you may end up with a fish kill. If you're too successful, all that decomposition undergoes oxygen decay. So it's very cautious. I always tell folks to take a small area, maybe 10% of an area, wait 2 weeks, do another 10%. Gives you an experience, how you want to use it, how well that control is going to be, and just be cautious when you do it.
Yeah.
Because once you cannot miraculously kill some plants if you kill too much of it.
Yep. That's great advice. I think be cautious. I think, you mentioned this a couple of times, but read the label of the chemicals you want to use, because there's a whole bunch of really important information on there about dosages, about restrictions. And, it goes back to correct plant ID, because you want to make sure that the expensive chemical you're going to use is the right one for the job.
Well, case in point, I used Aquat one time. And if I remember correctly, the direction was a 10-fold dilution rate. Well, me with a 2-gallon sprayer, I got tired of 10-fold dilution rate, so I decided not to do it. And I more concentrated, so you don't have as good a control. There's a reason why there is that dilution rate that goes on there. And also, when you look at chemicals, look at the active ingredients. Diquat's one of those compounds, and some of the other chemicals too. Look at what the active ingredient is and how much you're paying for it. Just because it's cheap, I should say, okay, why is it cheap? Is it because it's actually cheaper, or is it because it's half the concentration of what the more expensive is? And then a lot of folks ask, where can I find these chemicals at? A lot of some, I'm sure Indiana, same thing. A lot of the ag chemical companies has them. But look at the EPA. What you always have to think about, though, is that chemical approved in your state? Because not all, just one thing, but as years have gone by, a lot of people have instant access. They find these chemicals just because it's listed as US approved. Does not necessarily, it has to be licensed within the state you're in.
Yeah, and I think if you're trying to get a handle on your aquatic vegetation management, and you think you might be looking, going down the road of some chemicals, reach out and get some advice from someone, whether it's your local county agent or one of us here, or work with a professional, because they can help you make sure you get your ID right. But then they can also help you source the best or the correct chemical. I've heard stories of people who just get sold chemicals from somebody who's not in the profession, and then they end up with a fish kill. And so, I think, you put a lot of time and money into your pond, and you don't want to just make a mistake with a chemical application that blows a lot of that out of the water. So, because
I always tell folks, keep in mind, most mature ponds takes 3 to 5 years. Brand new pond, when you stock it out, what you don't want to do is mess it up in 1-2 week period.
That's right.
Start over again. And then also things too, when you deal with vegetation management too, you really need to try to get things under control before the winter hits. If you go into the winter time, the pond is shallow, you got a lot of vegetation, you get high ice, you could have winter kill issues that winter. So do it before winter comes as much as possible. And here's another case in point too, when you deal with herbicides, chemicals. If you deal with the chemical that has a long time action, like sonar, And you don't want to be putting that out in September or October because you're just spending your money on a chemical that you may not have an effect because it takes long time for it to act. And so I always cautious people, just be careful the timeline, what kind of what's the timeline you're dealing with, and nature may take care of the problem itself.
Yeah. No, I think, we cover this a bit in our upcoming publication, but, there are some chemicals are contact chemicals in that when they contact the plant, they kill the plant. Some of them are systemic or translocated through the plant. And then some of those whole system applications like fluoridone, they need 90 days or something in the pond because they restrict the plant's ability to photosynthesize. So some of them act, a few days, and some of them you need 3 months for to see a result. And so understanding that as part of your management plan is important.
And then part of that management plan too, as a landowner, have an idea what you're dealing with in advance of the following year. So I tell folks, if you think you're going to have a problem with watermeal, duckweed the following year, it may be too late for you to control this year, but have things in mind, have a management plan in place. It's the ideal time to control aquatic plants, vegetation chemically, early in the spring when the water temperature is cool. And the plants what I call naive. What I mean by that is plants are actively growing, and for them to, and so as you control a lot of these plants in midsummer, they got a waxy cuticle on the layer. It takes more chemical to control it. It's early, and the water temperature is hot. So it's just a danger. So early in the spring, as soon as you start seeing the issue, you think, but use your past history of that pond, whether or not you're going to have that problem in the following year, things like that, and have a strategy in place. But always keep in mind, year in, year out, pond owners, if you're not had a problem the last 3 years, don't worry about it. You don't want a pond completely blue and no vegetation.
So that brings me in, I guess, to one last question I have is that are most of these plants and algae, if are they going to be coming back year after year, or do you get some, year to year variation? How much can you use what you've seen in the past to predict what you might see in the future?
You probably get about 90% there. You
Yeah.
probably see if you couldn't tell in the year before, you'll see it again, and couldn't tell, and you can usually go into it also. Things like coontail, you can actually see it early in the spring as soon as the ice goes out. Sometimes it never dies back. And it'll be kind of really be dark green in that spring as soon as the ice goes out. Algae doesn't, but about 90% you'll see some changes, especially on mature ponds, but more or less about 90% you'll be seeing the same issue, things like that. But watermeal is one of those things. Whenever I see watermeal, I keep thinking, oh, dang, and there's not much I can do to help you on this.
Yeah, and so watermeal
that's
too.
Usually, and it goes back to my major professor years ago when I was a grad student at Texas A&M. And I remember I saw watermeal for the first time, and he was an Iowa farm kid himself. And he said, "Well, that usually tells me that the nutrients have gone sky high in previous years, and not much you can do about it."
And so watermeal and duckweed, for that matter, those floating plants will come back year after year as well.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you do, but in the spring though, if you hit like duckweed, watermeal, duckweed early in spring, that plant they don't have that cuticle layer, so it's better controlled chemical. If you're going to use chemical, duckweed and water, right before it gets so diffused across the whole pond body, take early in April, early May when the water temperature's cool, and then have it cast off to the side. And I'm a great proponent of using the less chemical you can use. If you're going to do that, be the most effective, efficient use of that chemical in the smallest area. And you can do, and we've all seen this ponds where early in spring you have a little bit of duckweed on the perimeter of the pond, on the edge with the wind. Just hit there. You don't want to hit the whole thing when the pond's completely covered with duckweed.
Thank you, Joe. It's been wonderful learning everything that you've taught us today. One of the questions that we really like to ask our guests is for recommendations on podcasts or publications or books that you have enjoyed that you found really useful related to urban pond management or vegetation management that you think our listeners should check out.
Sure. one of my go-to places for aquatic vegetation, and I say this in Iowa, is Aquaplants out of Texas A&M University. It's a
Okay.
web-based program. I don't know if you're familiar with that. It gives great photographs. Some of them, they have some of my photographs too, but it
Fantastic.
gives
Okay.
you identification. Again, the biggest problem is, what do you have? And what I always caution people though is this: just because you see it on Aquaplants, it's out of Texas A&M, does not necessarily mean you have it here.
Yeah.
Be cautious. This is where you work with you folks,
Mhm.
the people in your state. Make sure that. But that is good because it gives you good management plans, ideas on that. That the Iowa State University has a number of publications out there on aquatic vegetation. I teach category 5 here, and they're available through ISU Extension Bookstore.
Thank you.
That's
We
great. We'll make
will.
sure we link to those in the notes, and I will want to add one other thing. I know it's not my turn to say what recommendations, but I think having those plant ID resources are great. And one thing that I found recently was that the Wisconsin DNR has a great page where they have fact sheets on all the different types of herbicides for aquatic
Sure.
vegetation, and those fact sheets are great because they tell you how the chemical works, the restrictions there. It's not a substitute for reading the label, so still read the label, but they can give you a great idea. If someone recommends something to you, you can actually get a bit of information there, and it can help you decide whether it's right for you. Well, great. Well, thanks again, Joe. That was a great episode. We really enjoyed talking to you, and
Yes.
absolutely would love to get you back sometime to talk about some of the other interesting projects you've worked on. And I know you've got a lot of experience with fish too. So
I appreciate it.
yeah. Well, have a good day, and yeah,
You
we'll
too.
talk to you again soon.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
So Megan, that was a great episode with Joe. He's
Yes.
obviously got a wealth of experience doing all sorts of things, and we could have made that a 4.5 hour episode, but we decided not to. So, what were some of the new things that you learned today?
Just all the different types of just really paying attention to how all these different chemicals impact the different parts of the ecosystem, because maybe and this is something that I know, but you have to be reminded. And that's the fun thing about these podcasts is every time we have a guest on, some of the information I know, some of it is like, oh yeah, you should remember to do that. Think about or focus on how things are impacting one entity, because it may have a negative impact on something else. And that all comes down to what your goals are for your pond. If you want to have a blue pond, then maybe you don't want to have fish in it, but that really depends on what you're looking for. Another thing that he mentioned that we talk about all the time: make sure you are doing an assessment of your pond every spring. Just do a walk around, but we never talk about going in the pond and doing an assessment as part of that checklist. So taking a Secchi disc or taking a depth finder when you're doing your checklist, and making sure you're seeing how that depth is changing over the years, because that could be a telltale sign of a lot of siltation or a lot of runoff that's going into your pond system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I was, I mean, that's really why on this podcast we try and emphasize the ecosystem approach to this pond management. Ponds might seem simple, but there's a lot going on there, and he mentioned that sedimentation is really the root of a lot of our problems, and hearing that ponds can really fill up quickly, 5 to 7 years depending on your watershed and stuff like that. So just being aware of those things, and also I really like that he pointed out some of the potential negative impacts of these chemicals that we might not see. We might think of negative impacts as killing fish or making the water not safe to drink, but even if they are all safe for our fish and everything, they may be killing off the invertebrates, which are a really important food for the fry. And so you might be treating your pond with copper sulfate year after year, and you're wondering why your fish populations are not getting very good spawning events. It might be because they're killing off the food for those fish. So
yeah. If you enjoyed listening to our podcast, please make sure you do our survey. We want to know how you're utilizing this information that you're learning. If you have suggestions for future episodes, please let us know that as well. If you also enjoyed this episode, make sure you check out our network of podcasts. We are a part of a bigger network called Natural Resources University, and you may find episodes on those podcasts interesting as well.
Yeah, thanks, Megan. And also, be sure to check out our pond and land management extension website. So we have lots of publications on there, resources. If you're in Indiana, there's a place there where you can find your local professionals in your county. But that's where we release all our publications. And, I mentioned we're about to update some plant ID and plant management publications, and we'll put those up there. So check those out. And that's also an easy way to find my contact, at least, and get in touch with me. So
awesome.
Yeah, well, I think that's it. Another interesting episode, hopefully, for everyone. And a big congratulations to the 1-0, Megan.
Yes, 1-0. Whoop, whoop.
Whoa. Maybe we'll be saying 1-0 soon.
Maybe.
But yeah, it's been a lot of fun, and thanks for your help, Megan, and your motivation in making this happen. And thanks to all our listeners out there for supporting us. And we'll see you all for the next episode, the 1-1.
Bye, everybody.
Cheers. Bye. Pond University is hosted by Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant. Pond University is part of the podcast network Natural Resources University, which is supported by the Renewable Resources Extension Act. If you liked Pond University, then check out the other podcasts in the Natural Resources University podcast network. Purdue University and Illinois-Indiana Sea Grant are equal opportunity, equal access, and affirmative action institutions.